Italy, long before World War II, had some pretty optimistic territorial ambitions. In the heart of it all lay Mare Nostrum, which was developed shortly after their unification in the mid-19th century. Now, Mare Nostrum was essentially the idea that the Mediterranean Sea was an Italian lake. So they set their sights on pretty much conquering all coastal regions of the Mediterranean, and they believed that Rome's past control of this region justified their claims in the late 19th and early 20th century. So shortly after the unification, Italian nationalists began calling for the colonization of North Africa. After all, North Africa was sort of controlled by the declining Ottoman Empire. They hoped to take Tunisia initially, but that was taken by the French, so they set their sights on Libya. And they conquered Libya in the early 20th century after the Italo-Turkish War, and they entered World War I with the promise of further territorial gains in the Balkans in particular, and shortly after World War I, they tried unsuccessfully to take parts of Western Anatolia from the new Republic of Turkey. But the first region in Europe, at least, that the fascists took was Albania, but the Italians had hoped to take Albania for some time. For instance, in 1910, when the Albanians were revolting against the Ottomans, a lot of Italian nationalists, including one of Garibaldi's sons, helped send aid to the rebels, and they were promised the region as well as parts of Dalmatia for joining in World War I. However, they were kicked out by Albanian nationalists as part of the Vlora War in 1920. I bring all this up to say that the fascists didn't make Italy expansionist, they just further developed on old plans. For instance, they came up with the concept of spazio vitale, things similar to Germany's Lebensraum, but without the sort of racial connotation. They would allow a lot of the conquered people to keep their own language and customs and stuff like that. It seemed more just the desire to get raw materials. Now, they claimed pretty much all of the Balkans, but it sort of changed over time. For instance, some people claimed to conquer as far east as Bulgaria, for instance, but their failed wars in the Balkans soon put an end to these plans. They, of course, failed to conquer Yugoslavia by themselves, so they needed help from Germany, and Germany created an independent state out of Croatia, which of course angered the Italians because they wanted that region. So, to try and counter Nazi dominance in the region, a general named Giuseppe Pichet tried to create he proposed to create a sort of puppet state out of the Muslim Bosnian region, but of course nothing came of these plans. Anyway, over to Western Europe. Now, the Italians for a long time had claims to parts of Switzerland, the Italian-speaking parts of Switzerland, so during the war they worked with the Germans and planned Operation Tannenbaum to invade Switzerland, and the Italians were promised the Italian provinces, but of course nothing happened of this. But further out west, they wanted to take Gibraltar because Gibraltar, along with the Suez Canal in the east, had the capacity to blockade the whole Mediterranean. But one of the Italians' most bold plans was to create a Latin union with the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese. Now, this union, the Latin bloc as it was called, was very unlikely to really be created, but it's worth mentioning all the same. It first arose in the 1920s and had some supporters amongst other fascists in different nations. For instance, Valois of France supported the idea. But besides a couple speeches, nothing really came of it. However, once Franco took over Spain and Vichy France was established, it seemed a little more likely. There were some talks between the leaders and some high-ranking politicians like Laval of Vichy France. He was famous for the Laval Pact before the war. He also supported the idea, so it was a little more likely to happen then. Now, this Latin bloc is interesting because for a long time Mussolini and the Italian fascists saw Nazi Germany as a threat. Well, the Latin bloc would also make the Latin nations less reliant on countries like Britain and the US. But in 1934, Mussolini said that Nazi Germany yesterday went after Christian civilization, today are after Latin civilization, and tomorrow after world civilization. So it was sort of initially planned to stand up to Nazi domination of Europe. In fact, the Italian fascists were strongly opposed to Germany's anschluss with Austria, and shortly after their invasion of Poland, Italo Balbo opposed an alliance with Germany and said that the Italians would end up shining German shoes. So, like the sort of creation of Bosnia in a way that I mentioned before, and the Latin bloc, a lot of Italian plans during the war were aimed at sort of standing up to a potential victorious Germany. Finally, on to Africa. Now, it was in Africa, after they annexed Ethiopia, that all potential alliances between France, Britain, and Italy were put to an end, and Mussolini sided with Hitler. But their ambitions in Africa long predate the war once again. Now I should mention quickly that the Italians had plans to take Egypt and secure the Suez Canal, and they built large highways in Libya to sort of make transport easier, but this is all part of Mare Nostrum. Now the Italian claims to Ethiopia came during the scramble for Africa. After all, they had taken a colony in Eritrea, and they took parts of Somalia, and Ethiopia would have connected these colonies in East Africa, but they failed in their war to take the region, but they never gave up their claims. However, I think their ambitions in East Africa were a lot larger than just connecting these two colonies. For instance, in southern Libya, they began to slowly push further south, and even in the mid-30s, the British and French were willing to make some concessions in the region, especially just north of Lake Chad and parts of Sudan. Now, one British diplomat who was present for a lot of these talks, named Maurice Peterson, soon put an end to Italy's, let's say, peaceful conquest south of Libya. And that's because he was worried that the Italians were trying to go so far south that they could fly a plane from southern Libya to Eritrea without having to stop refueling in the Sudan. Now this would put British Egypt under the threat of air attacks. But knowing with hindsight that the Italians eventually conquered Ethiopia, it's probably safe to assume that they were trying to connect Somalia, Eritrea with Libya. However, the Italians, long before the war, also looked to establish a presence in West Africa, and that's because after World War I, Germany lost Cameroon. Cameroon was then divided sort of between Britain and France, but it was also sort of a League of Nations mandate. But the Italians claimed Cameroon, and Italo Balbo, who was appointed by the fascists as the governor of Libya, was assigned to press these claims. But of course it failed. However, if you look at Libya's gradual expansion south into sort of the Chad region, you can probably assume that this expansion southward would have ended in Cameroon. Now this would have given the Italians a long corridor through Africa connecting the Indian Ocean, Somalia, to Cameroon and the Atlantic Ocean. Now to sort of sum all that up briefly, before the war the Italians hoped to conquer a lot of the coastal regions of the Mediterranean, so parts of Turkey, the Balkans, Egypt, stuff like that. And in Western Europe they hoped to unite a lot of the Latin nations, France, Spain, Portugal and also Belgium, and I didn't mention before, but they also had some diplomatic talks with the Argentinians in order to create a large Latin Union. And in Africa they wanted to expand as far south as Cameroon and, in my opinion, connect Cameroon through Libya and on to East Africa, Ethiopia, Eritrea and Somalia. But during the war they became very preoccupied with stopping German domination of the continent in order to be able to stand up to them once the war was over.